No one looking at her life in the early 1990s would have guessed how deeply one night would follow her for decades. At the time, Joy Dickerson Neal was a college student in New York, focused on school independence and building a future that felt entirely her own. The city around her moved fast, full of promise and noise, and she was just another young woman trying to find her place in it. What she didn't know was that a single encounter would quietly reshape everything that came after. Before we continue, if you're drawn to cinematic true crime stories that uncover what often gets buried beneath headlines, take a moment to support the channel. Stories like this depend on attention, memory, and the willingness to listen. In 1991, New York City was electric and unforgiving. Power meant access, and access meant protection. For young people trying to navigate adulthood, the line between opportunity and danger was often invisible until it was crossed. Joy Dickerson Neal was not chasing fame. She wasn't part of the music industry. She wasn't connected to celebrity circles. She was living a normal life, going to classes, managing relationships, and planning a future that made sense to her. That's when Sean Diddy Combs entered her world, not as a global icon he would later become, but as a rising figure with influence, ambition, and growing authority in entertainment circles. According to Joy, what followed was not a story of glamour or mutual connection, but something far more unsettling. She has alleged that she was drugged during an encounter, leaving her disoriented and unable to give consent. In the years that followed, she would describe waking up confused, afraid, and unsure what happened to her body or her sense of control. At the time, she says, she didn't have a language, power, or support to challenge someone with far more influence than she had. What made the experience even more devastating, she later alleged, was a claim that the encounter was secretly recorded and then shown to others without her knowledge or consent. For Joy, this wasn't just a violation in the moment. It was something that lingered, a sense that her autonomy had been taken in ways she couldn't see or undo. But in the early 1990s, conversations about consent, power imbalance, and trauma were not what they are today. Reporting an allegation against a powerful man came with real risks, social, professional, and personal. Joy says she chose survival over confrontation. She finished school. She moved forward. She tried to live. Outwardly, life continued. Inwardly, the experience followed her into relationships, into trust, into how safe the world felt. Trauma doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it settles quietly, shaping decisions in ways even the person carrying it doesn't fully realize at first. Years turned into decades. Sean Combs became one of the most recognizable names in music and business. His public image grew, success, wealth, influence. Meanwhile, Joy Dickerson Neal lived a life far removed from that spotlight. She built a career, became a mother, and tried to create stability. But according to her, the memories never fully loosened their grip. Then, in 2023, something shifted. As public conversations around accountability, power, and long silence voices intensified, Joy made a decision that would pull her story into the open. She filed a lawsuit accusing Combs of sexual assault, drugging, and intentional emotional harm. The filing didn't just describe a single night. It outlined the long-term psychological impact she says followed her for years. The response was immediate and polarizing. Combs has denied the allegations, calling them false. Supporters and critics took sides. Media coverage exploded, and Joy's name, once private, became a public identifier attached to a deeply personal story. For Joy, speaking out wasn't about revenge or attention. According to her legal filings, it was about acknowledgement, about naming something that had shaped her life in silence. But with that choice came a new wave of challenges. Public scrutiny, doubt, and emotional weight of reliving events many would rather forget. Behind every headline was a woman navigating what it meant to be believed, questioned, and exposed all at once. Lawsuits are not just legal battles. They are emotional ones. They ask survivors to turn memory into evidence and pain into testimony. As the case moved forward, questions followed. Why now? Why speak after so many years? The answers for Joy were tied to timing, readiness, and a belief that silence no longer felt survivable. Trauma doesn't operate on a schedule, and healing doesn't always come quietly. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? What does life look like after stepping into a storm you avoided for decades? And once a story like this becomes public, can anything ever return to what was before? Those questions would come to define the next chapter of Joy Dickerson Neal's life, not just legally, but emotionally and socially. And as the case unfolded, another reality became clear. Speaking up was only the beginning. When the lawsuit became public, Joy Dickerson Neal's private world shifted overnight. What had lived quietly in court filings and personal memory was suddenly everywhere. Headlines, social media debates, opinion panels, and comment sections filled with strangers deciding who she was and what her story meant. Her name, once known only to family and close friends, was now tied to a global figure and a public controversy she could no longer control. For Joy, the attention was not empowering. It was overwhelming. According to her legal filings, the decision come forward was never about visibility. It was about acknowledgement. But acknowledgement came with exposure, and exposure came with a cost she had spent decades trying to avoid. Every detail of her past was suddenly treated as public property. Her education, her work, her family life, all examined, questioned, and filtered through a narrative she did not write. Support arrived, but so did skepticism. Some believed her immediately. Others dismissed her outright. And many reduced her story to a headline stripped of context and humanity. Sean Combs, through his legal team, denied the allegations, maintaining that the claims were false. The denial itself became part of the story, reinforcing how divided public perception had become. In the court of public opinion, truth often feels secondary to loyalty, influence, and image. For Joy, the emotional toll was immediate, according to people close to her. Reliving the experience in interviews and legal proceedings reopened wounds she had spent years trying to manage quietly. Trauma, once named, does not simply disappear. It reshapes itself, especially when placed under a spotlight. The lawsuit also forced her to confront a painful reality. Speaking up does not guarantee peace. It often brings confrontation instead. Friends reached out, but some relationships grew strained. Others went silent. Even those who wanted to support her didn't always know how. Still, Joy stood by her decision. In her filings, she described the long-term emotional impact she says the alleged incident had on her life. Anxiety, fear, and a lingering sense of vulnerability that followed her into adulthood. This, she argued, was not about the past alone. It was about the present, and about reclaiming control over her own narrative. As the legal process moved forward, the case became part of a broader cultural conversation. Discussions about power, consent, and accountability resurfaced, reminding the public how often stories like this remain untold. Not because they didn't happen, but because the cost of telling them can feel unbearable. Eventually, the lawsuit was settled. The terms were not fully disclosed, and both sides moved on publicly. For many observers, that marked the end of the story. Headlines faded. Attention shifted. Another news cycle replaced it. But for Joy Dickerson Neal, the story did not end there. Life after the lawsuit was quieter, but not untouched. According to public records and statements, she focused on rebuilding a sense of normalcy, prioritizing her family, her work, and her own well-being. She did not become a public figure. She did not seek interviews or continued attention. Instead, she stepped back, choosing privacy after a period when privacy had been impossible. Her life today is largely removed from the spotlight that briefly consumed it. What remains is not notoriety, but resilience. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that exists in choosing to keep living fully even after being reduced to a single chapter of one's life. Joy's story raises uncomfortable questions that don't come with easy answers. What does justice look like decades later? Who gets believed and why? And what happens to people after the cameras turn away? Some stories don't end with verdict or settlement. They end with reflection, with the recognition that behind every headline is a human being carrying consequences long after public interest fades. Joy Dickerson Neal is not defined solely by an allegation, a lawsuit, or a name attached to someone else's fame. She is a woman who chose to speak after years of silence, fully aware of what it might cost her. Whether one believes her claims or not, Her decision underscores a truth that often goes unspoken. Coming forward is rarely simple, and it is never free. If stories like this matter to you, stories that look beyond headlines and focus on the human cost of power, silence, and accountability, consider supporting the channel. Your engagement helps keep these conversations alive, long after the noise fades. After the settlement, the public conversation began to quiet down, but silence doesn't mean resolution. For Joy Dickerson Neal, the absence of headlines didn't erase what had already been exposed. It simply shifted the weight from public scrutiny to private processing, where there were no cameras, no statements, and no control narratives. Settlements often come with assumptions. To some, they suggest closure. To others, they raise suspicion. But for the people inside them, they are rarely emotional conclusions. They are legal pauses. According to public information, the terms of the agreement were not disclosed, leaving room for speculation but little clarity. What remained clear was that Joy did not re-enter the public arena to explain or defend her choice. Instead, she stepped away. Those close to her have described a period marked by rebuilding rather than relief. Legal battles can end on paper, while emotional consequences continue unfolding quietly. The act of coming forward had already changed how she was perceived, not just by the public, but by institutions, workplaces, and social circles that now knew her through a single narrative. For someone who had never sought visibility, that loss of anonymity carried its own kind of grief. In the months following the settlement, the broader cultural landscape continued shifting. Other accusations against powerful figures emerged. Patterns were debated. Power dynamics were re-examined. And in that noise, Joy's story became one of many. Sometimes referenced, sometimes forgotten, often simplified. But simplification strips away reality. What rarely makes headlines is the afterlife of allegations, the way they follow a person into ordinary spaces, grocery stores, schools, doctors' offices, digital footprints that never fully disappear. Joy was not just moving forward as an individual, but as someone permanently associated with a public accusation tied to a global celebrity. And then there was the internet. Search results don't forget. Names become keywords. Context collapses into summaries. For Joy, this meant living with the knowledge that her children, colleagues, or acquaintances could one day encounter her story without her there to explain it. That kind of permanence changes how a person moves through the world. At the same time, she was careful not to let the story become her entire identity. According to available records, she continued working, parenting, and maintaining a life grounded in routine rather than reaction. There were no public tours, no memoir announcements, no attempts to shape public opinion after the case faded from the news cycle. That choice itself was telling. It suggested that speaking up had never been about recognition, only about truth, or at least the ability to name one's own experience out loud after years of silence. Meanwhile, Sean Combs' public image continued to evolve, shaped by business ventures, media appearances, and later allegations unrelated to Joy's case. The contrast was stark. One life moved forward in visibility. The other chose distance. This imbalance is not unique. It is part of what makes cases like this linger beneath the surface of public consciousness. Power doesn't just affect what happens. It affects what endures. For Joy, endurance looked quiet. It looked like choosing privacy in a world that had briefly denied it to her. It looked like accepting that some people would never believe her, and that belief was not something she could control. What she could control was how much more of herself the world was allowed to take. And yet, questions remained, not just about the past, but about what comes after speaking up. Does telling your story actually free you? Or does it simply trade one kind of silence for another? Those questions don't have answers yet. Because the truth is, Joy Dickerson Neal's story isn't finished. It's just no longer public. What happens after a story disappears from the news is often more revealing than what happens while it dominates headlines. For Joy Dickerson Neal, the quiet that followed was not empty. It was filled with adjustments. Small, constant decisions about how to live in a world that now knew something deeply personal about her. Time didn't erase the label that had been attached to her name. It simply made it less visible to others, while remaining present to her. In private spaces, she was still a mother, a professional, a woman navigating daily responsibilities. But in public records and digital archives, she existed forever inside a controversy she hadn't chosen to publicize in the first place. That duality is one of the least discussed consequences of speaking out. Even without interviews or public statements, the story continued to move on its own. Articles were reposted. Timelines were updated. New allegations involving other figures caused older cases to resurface, often summarized in a single paragraph that flattened years of experience into a few lines of text. Context was lost. Nuance disappeared. For Joy, this meant learning to live with misinterpretation. Some assumed the settlement meant admission. Others assumed it meant fabrication. Few paused to consider the reality that legal outcomes rarely align neatly with emotional truth. Settlements resolve disputes. They don't define what someone lived through. That distinction mattered to her, even if it didn't to the public. People close to Joy have described her as intentional about boundaries during this period. She did not engage online debates. She did not correct strangers. She did not attempt to reclaim the narrative through exposure. Instead, she narrowed her world, focusing on what was immediate, tangible, and within her control. Family became central. Routine became grounding. Normalcy, even when imperfect, became a form of resistance. At the same time, the broader culture continued to grapple with how stories like hers should be understood. Conversations about delayed reporting, power imbalance, and consent evolved, but not evenly. Progress came alongside backlash. Empathy competed with suspicion. In that climate, silence was not always interpreted as dignity. Sometimes it was read as weakness. But silence can also be protection. For Joy, not responding publicly was a way of reclaiming something she had lost: ownership over her time, her energy, and her emotional space. Speaking once had required immense effort. Speaking again would have demanded even more, with no guarantee of understanding. And so she didn't. This choice highlighted another uncomfortable truth. Society often expects survivors to educate, explain, and endure endlessly. To be credible, they must be visible. To be believed, they must be consistent. To remain sympathetic, they must never grow tired of telling the same story. Joy stepped away from that expectation. As years passed, her life took on a rhythm that had nothing to do with court filings or celebrity names. Work deadlines replaced legal ones. Parenting concerns replaced public scrutiny. The world, slowly, gave her space, not out of respect, but out of distraction. Yet the past remained reachable, just a search bar away. That awareness shaped how she thought about the future, about what it means to be remembered, about how narratives harden over time, especially when one side has a louder voice than the other. Power doesn't only exist in the moment of an alleged act. It exists in who gets to move on without explanation, and who must live with an explanation forever attached to their name. Joy's experience sits in that imbalance, not as a headline anymore, but as a case study in what happens after someone speaks and the world decides it's heard enough. And the question that lingers is not about guilt or innocence alone. It's about aftermath, about what accountability looks like when it doesn't come with validation, about how people rebuild when the resolution offered by the system does not match the complexity of lived experience. Distance has a way of changing how stories are carried, not erased, just held differently. For Joy Dickerson-Neal, the years that followed were shaped less by what had been said publicly and more by what was no longer required of her. There were no court dates to prepare for, no legal strategies to consider, no statements to weigh. What remained was a slower, quieter work of living. But even distance has limits. Certain moments had a way of pulling the past forward without warning. A name mentioned in conversation, a headline resurfacing online, a documentary clip playing on a screen she hadn't chosen. Each reminder arrived without context, reopening a narrative she no longer had the ability or desire to guide. This is one of the invisible consequences of high-profile accusations. They do not stay contained within their original moment. They return, reshaped by time and retelling. For Joy, this meant developing a careful awareness of her surroundings. She learned when to disengage, when to redirect, and when to remain silent, not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. Silence, in this phase of her life, was no longer forced. It was chosen. Those who know her describe a person who values stability above all else, predictable routines, safe spaces, relationships built on trust rather than explanation. These were not retreats. They were foundations. And yet, there was an underlying awareness that her story had become part of a larger conversation she could not fully step away from. Discussions about accountability, delayed justice, and power dynamics often reference cases like hers. Even when her name wasn't spoken directly, she became an example without being present. This created a strange form of distance, being relevant without being involved, being discussed without being consulted. It's a position many never anticipate when they choose to speak once and then stop. What complicates this further is the way public memory works. Over time, details blur. Motivations are questioned. Narratives simplify. The longer a story exists without updates, the more it becomes shaped by assumption rather than fact. For Joy, watching this from afar required restraint. Correcting misinformation would have meant re-entering a space she had deliberately left. Letting it go meant accepting that some versions of her story would exist without her consent. That acceptance did not come easily. It required a recalibration of what justice meant to her personally, not as a legal outcome, but as an internal one. Justice became less about public acknowledgement and more about personal boundaries, less about being believed by everyone, and more about being believed by herself. This shift marked a turning point. Rather than seeing her experience as something that defined her, she began to see it as something that informed her, a difference subtle enough to change how she related to her own past. The story remained, but no longer occupied the center of her life. There's power in that distinction. It's the difference between being shaped by trauma and being consumed by it, between remembering and reliving, between carrying something and being carried by it. From the outside, this transformation was invisible. There were no public milestones, no announcements, no signals of progress. Healing, when it happens privately, rarely leaves evidence. But those closest to Joy noticed it in small ways, in confidence, in clarity, in her refusal to let other people's interpretations dictate her sense of self. The world had moved on, as it always does, but she had not been left behind by it. Instead, she had learned how to walk alongside a past that could no longer control her present, even if it could never be fully erased. And as time continued forward, another reality quietly took shape. Joy Dickerson Neal's story was no longer just about what happened to her. It was about what happens after someone chooses not to explain themselves anymore. There's a point in long public stories where attention fades, but impact remains. For Joy Dickerson Neal, this phase arrived quietly. No announcement marked it. No clear boundaries separated before and after. Instead, it showed up in a way her days felt less reactive, less defined by anticipation of the past resurfacing. She had learned something many never do, that public silence does not always mean vulnerability. Sometimes it means control. By this stage, the story existed mostly outside of her daily life. It lived in archives, in legal summaries, in articles that were occasionally reshared when broader conversations flared up again. But for her, those references became background noise rather than a call to action. This didn't mean the experience lost significance. It meant its position changed. What once felt like an open wound became a scar, still present, still real, but no longer demanding constant attention. That shift allowed her to think beyond survival and toward intention. How she wanted to be remembered by those who actually knew her. What values she wanted to pass on. What kind of life felt honest after everything that had happened. In private, these questions mattered more than any public interpretation ever could. She became more selective with her energy. Not everyone needed access to her story. Not every conversation required explanation. Trust became something earned slowly, not assumed. These boundaries weren't defensive, they were deliberate. This was especially true in a world that increasingly treats personal history as content. Documentaries, podcasts, and commentary continue to grow around similar cases, often emphasizing shock and spectacle. Joy did not participate in this ecosystem. Her absence wasn't accidental. It was a refusal to let her experience be repackaged for consumption. That refusal carried weight. It challenged an unspoken expectation that once someone speaks publicly, they owe the public continued access. Joy rejected that idea entirely. Speaking once had been an act of courage. Staying silent afterward was an act of autonomy. Over time, people around her adjusted. New connections met her, without preconceived narratives. Old connections learned what not to ask. Life reorganized itself around the present instead of the past. And yet, awareness never fully disappeared. She understood that her name would always be linked to someone else's power and reputation in ways that felt fundamentally unfair. That reality didn't vanish, but it stopped dictating her decisions. Instead of asking how others might interpret her story, she began asking how she wanted to live with it. This internal shift mattered more than any external validation, because stories like hers often become symbolic, stripped of individuality, and reshaped to serve arguments larger than the person at the center. Joy resisted becoming a symbol. She remained specific, grounded, private. In doing so, she reclaimed something subtle but essential, authorship over her own life, not over how the world talked about her, but over how she understood herself. At a certain point, stories stopped belonging to the public and returned to the people who lived them. For Joy Dickerson Neal, that return did not come through closure or resolution in the way outsiders often expect. It came through acceptance, not of what others believed, but of what she knew to be true about her own experience. By now, her life had settled into something steady, not untouched by the past, but no longer shaped by it in visible ways. The noise that once surrounded her name had softened into distance, and with that distance came clarity. She did not redefine herself through the case. She refused to let one chapter stand in for an entire life. Instead, she focused on what was present, her responsibilities, her relationships, and the quiet choices that define a person more accurately than any headline ever could. In many ways, her decision to step back became the most telling part of her story. The public often expects survivors to be visible, vocal, and endlessly available for interpretation. Joy chose the opposite. She allowed the story to end where it needed to, not for the audience, but for herself. That choice carried a kind of strength that rarely gets acknowledged. It meant living with ambiguity, accepting that not everyone would understand, letting go of the need to correct, convince, or clarify, trusting that her truth did not require constant defense in order to exist. And that is where her story ultimately rests. Not in court documents or media summaries, but in the space between memory and meaning. What happened to Joy Dickerson Neal became part of the public record. What she became afterward did not. That distinction matters. Because while public narratives often reduce people to moments of conflict, real lives continue far beyond them. They grow quieter, more private, more real. Joy's journey reminds us that survival doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace over explanation, privacy over validation, and forward motion over endless reflection. Not every story ends with justice as the world defines it. Some end with self-possession, the decision to carry on without asking permission from anyone watching. And in that sense, Joy Dickerson Neal's story does not conclude with an answer. It concludes with life, lived on her own terms, beyond the reach of headlines and outside the frame of public judgment. If you value stories that go beyond headlines, support the channel by subscribing, sharing, and share your opinion into the comment section. It helps keep these news stories coming.